We really would love to know what your plan is to help lower the cost of living.
In terms of both rightly having the right to have aspirations and dreams and ambitions for your family, and working hard and finding that the American dream is, for this generation and so many recently, far more elusive than it's been.
A few moments later.
Regards to groceries.
Okay. It seems like you're having a hard time articulating your plan. And
I'm not. Honestly, that's not true. Please, I'm constantly being interrupted by you, which, as a woman, I think is disrespectful. When I'm trying to speak, every time I try and speak, you speak over.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Musari Show. Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing a heck of a soap opera. Welcome back to the Musari Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us in this episode. Please hit the like and subscribe button. So, anybody that knows me personally or anybody that has been following this podcast closely knows that one issue that's really been getting me anxious is the whole taxes and unrealized gains proposed by Kamala Harris. Why does it concern me? If you've been following my podcast on Spotify for the past few months, you would have noticed an episode where I talk about how Africa can replicate the whole Silicon Valley model to kind of advance the tech startup industry, right? And I talk about how the Silicon Valley industry evolved. And it happened around the World War. I believe it was the Second World War around the 1950s. So basically, we've seen the evolution of the tech industry as a result of the access to capital that was provided from the venture funding industry, right? Many times when we talk about the history of Silicon Valley or the tech industry in the US, we normally talk about it from a founder or entrepreneur's perspective. We talk about how Steve Jobs and Bill Gates made major contributions earlier on in the Industrial Revolution of information technology when the whole computer business was really booming. But we don't talk about it more from a venture funding perspective. So the book called The Power Law does an excellent job of expounding this issue more from a founder's perspective, right? So now, when I heard the issue of taxes and realized gains, it made me really concerned. Why so? I believe that the whole venture funding model in the United States has played a very big role in giving the United States competitive advantage globally when it comes to technology and when it comes to the whole AI race, which is very heated at the moment, right? So if you want to maintain competitive advantage as a country, you obviously want to incentivize venture funding. You want to incentivize, access to capital to these brilliant startups that are creating innovations that are going to rock the world. Now, when you tax on realized gains, that's going to kill that incentive. Why? Because on top of being taxed on the capital gains when they cash the money out, when they make the returns, right? You're going to be charged additional taxes. You're going to have additional tax bills on the capital gains periodically during that investment period. That is going to disincentivize investment. Disincentivized investment means that you're going to make access to capital difficult. So anyways, after the proposal was announced, I did see an interview on CNBC where Andy Blocker, who is the global head of public policy at Invesco, and Dan Primack, who is the business editor at Axios, were invited to share their 2 cents on how Silicon Valley was panicking. Let's watch this clip where they react to that, then we're going to come back and break down and share our thoughts on that.
Let's talk more about this now, what it could all mean for the economy and markets. Andy Blocker is Global Head of Public Policy and Strategic Partnerships at Invesco, and Dan Primack is Business Editor at Axios. Dan, let me just start with you. What are you hearing in terms of how this would exactly work and hit maybe Silicon Valley or startup culture in particular, and just kind of anything else that people think would be impactful?
Yeah, I mean, for starters, when we refer to this as the Harris economic plan, it's the Biden economic plan. All the details that Robert just mentioned were all in the White House's fiscal 24 and fiscal 25 budgets, neither of which they fought terribly hard for in Congress. And I understand the Trump tax cuts are going to expire in a year, so things will change a bit. But Harris herself hasn't come out with anything new on capital gains. Her campaign has simply said, we agree with what the White House had proposed previously. Silicon Valley's gotten really freaked out about this unrealized capital gains tax, which you can understand, right? A lot of them own a good deal of stock in private companies. One thing to note, though, in addition to the $100 million in wealth, which is where this kicks in, you have to be over 80% liquid for it to kick in. In other words, if you are worth $100 million, but almost all of that is because of your startup's stock, you would not apply for this, at least immediately. There's kind of some deferrals that get kicked in.
And Andy, a lot of people have suggested, well, could this apply to home equity, for instance, if your house has gone up in value, but that as current policy, homes are often excluded. Obviously, this would only apply to people under over $100 million. But to Dan's point about the slippery slope, once you start taxing unrealized capital gains, does that open the door, pave the way for that to kind of go more mainstream in future years?
No, I think you're onto something there, Kelly. I mean, look, these are very aggressive policies. There's a discussion about, can you really tax unrealized gains, when you can and when you can't? And look, you definitely have to have that 80% liquidity requirement, because you can't have people having to sell property to pay their taxes, right? So on that sense, will have to be dealt with on the details.
I think, Dan, there's often a lot of confusion around this, in some part generated by the media, because we often cover pay packages of executives whose pay might not actually be realized. It might be a lot of unrealized gains, for instance, but it's often treated as, oh, so-and-so has this many hundreds of million dollars, or this many billions of dollars. And do we need to start making a distinction between unrealized and realized gains? Or I don't know. It's just, I think it's all playing into this idea of how much sort of liquid money or cash people really have.
It does. And then you have the secondary piece where obviously people can take out loans. And what does that mean? Because that's debt. Is that actually considered an asset as far as the IRS or the White House would be concerned? But again, it goes back to, these are proposals that have been around for over 2 years. They haven't really gotten anywhere with a Democratic White House. They came from a Democratic White House. I think kind of what I'm hoping for, and Iman kind of mentioned, is we're not going to get any specific economic policies tonight from Kamala Harris. That's not what this speech is for. But do we get some kind of anything new that comes out in the next week or two, which differs her economic policy and tax policy from the current White House, outside of the price gouging stuff and being a little bit tougher on certain mergers, although the current White House is suing to stop the Kroger-Albertsons merger already. Yeah,
Andy, I'm also curious about what's going to happen with the expected to expire tax cut package that Trump had passed, in particular things like SALT. Now, Schumer, I thought, had indicated that perhaps he was going to find some way of restoring those deductions, which could amount to quite a big savings for wealthier individuals as well under her administration.
No, I think definitely Senator Schumer and a lot of the New York, New Jersey delegation and a lot of the states where this is really impactful, they're going to be pushing hard to make sure they restore some of those tax breaks under SALT. But it costs a lot of money. And if you were going to extend all the tax cuts or for the Trump tax cuts, it'd be about $4.5 trillion. So it's a lot of money. And we know Trump would try to do that, or most of it. Well, Vice President Kamala Harris, her thing is anyone making over $400,000, she doesn't want to extend those tax cuts. Corporations, she's always said, going from 21 to 28%. But at the end of the day on this, it's too early to kind of tell here. You're going to have full control of Congress, the House and Senate, and the presidency to enact your plan. So we're waiting here to see how this election kind of goes out. But the process and the makeup of the entire government has a big impact on what can and cannot happen.
Absolutely. These are kind of wish lists, as they always have been in budgetary exercises and so forth. But these are where the rubber hits the road, depending on how big the gains are for either party who takes the White House. Guys, thank you both for now. We'll leave it there. We appreciate it. Andy Blocker and Dan Primack.
So you heard the interview on CNBC. From Andy Blocker and Dan Primack's comments, it did kind of sound like this whole policy and proposal was kind of fresh, because even at that time, my understanding of the policy was also a bit limited. As one of them did actually say, he did state, okay, let's give it some time to see how things pan out and also to basically get a better understanding of the policies. I'm basically paraphrasing what he said. And over time, we did notice that, the taxes on unrealized gains were applicable to the people who have net worth of $100 million or above. However, this seems to be the very niche of people that are part of the venture funding community in the United States, right? So I did do some research and check out this graph, right? This research shows how much venture funding has been trending in the last couple of years. So in 2020, venture funding in the United States was totaling $171.4 billion. That went up to $345.4 billion in 2021. However, we did see a decline ever since to $242.2 billion in 2022. and $170.6 billion in 2023. There are some headwinds in economic factors that did contribute to that decline. So after COVID, we see a very sharp increase in venture funding, and that did decrease a little bit, right? I did notice that around the same period, the stock market in the United States was also a bit inflated. Then we did see a market correction. And parallel to that, we also saw a correction in tech valuation and tech venture valuations between 2021 and 2022 that contributed to the downward trend in venture funding. On top of that, we saw rising interest rates. We saw that there was economic uncertainty, and as a result of all the economic headwinds, there are fewer exits. There are fewer companies that were IPOing, that were doing initial purchase offerings in the stock market, and as a result, there were less exits from a lot of the venture capitals. So in other words, they had to hold on to their investments for a bit more time before pulling it out. However, there have been a lot of concerns of the investment community around the whole taxes and unrealized gains. We have seen a couple of headlines by Mark Cuban, who happens to be pro-Democrat, where he's expressing the impact that could have in the stock market. In the previous episode, I did break down that the top 50% of the US economy have a major contribution in the stock market, and they influence the stock prices in the market. We did also see that Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank, who happens to be a peer of Mark Cuban, also expresses concern around the whole policy of taxes and unrealized gains, to the point that he decided to approach the advisors in Kamala Harris's campaign to understand what on earth was going on. So now, in the event that Kamala Harris does win the elections, God knows what's going to happen, this means that this downward trend of venture funding in the United States is going to decline. This completely contradicts the whole narrative being painted by the people on the left, that they want to position America to be competitive globally when it comes to startups, when it comes to tech startups, when it comes to AI. A lot of the AI technology is going to be coming from brilliant entrepreneurs that have the potential to be funded, that don't yet have access to finance, that need money from these communities. And all of a sudden, if you're taxing realized gains, that's going to cause that to pull it back. Because guys, money doesn't grow on trees. I mean, rising interest rates affects everybody. There is this notion that inflation and rising interest rates don't affect people in the millionaire and billionaire brackets. That's a big fat lie. Why did we see a big decline in venture funding during the very same period? So I personally do think that taxes and unrealized gains is a threat to the United States' competitive advantage in AI and technology worldwide. On the flip side, there is a school of thought in the thinking and the whole notion that Kamala Harris's campaign is just making this promise and getting the proposal out there to attract votes, but the intention is not to necessarily implement that. That's what Kevin O'Leary was told by the advisors in their camp. But either way, I seriously do believe that there are smarter ways and more constructive policies that one can propose to attract votes, instead of doing something like that that can scare the hell out of people. In their own words, Silicon Valley freaked out when they heard that. But anyways, those are my 2 cents. Let us know what you think. Do you think taxes and realized gains will be enforced should Kamala Harris wins? And do you think that this will completely destroy the United States competitive advantage when it comes to tech and AI technology? Let us know your thoughts. See you in the next episode, and thanks for joining us. God bless.
I have a great playlist. I have a playlist that's
Kamala, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, Kamala, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, Kamala, Kamala, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, Kamala, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, Kamala, Kamala, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, Kamala, ay Kamala.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Musari Show.